The winter wind bit through the boards of a small Michigan shed where a young Henry Ford hunched over brass and gears, the smell of oil and cold metal filling the air like a promise. He wasn't born to grandeur. He was born to work. Yet even the rough honesty of that barn couldn't steady the path ahead. Twice he watched companies he'd poured his sweat into fold like paper. Assets auctioned off, partners walking away, the polite laughter of the city's elite trailing behind him. "You're a tinkerer, not a businessman," a banker told him once, leaning back in a leather chair that seemed to breathe disdain. "Stick to the farm." The laughter was not cruel for cruelty's sake. It was survival's way of naming winners and losers, and Henry felt that punch in his chest every time the newspapers ran another thinly veiled joke. We see him there, in courtroom light, signature trembling as creditors divide what remains. We hear the murmur in a gentleman's club, "He tried twice and failed twice." But these moments, raw and humiliating, were not endings so much as pressure. Each failure scraped false certainty from his bones and left a cleaner hunger. He cataloged mistakes like blueprints, bad timing, sloppy production, selling to the wrong client, pricing that excluded the many. In the quiet after bankruptcy, he did what most beaten men do not. He learned to think at scale. Not with bravado, but with a stubborn arithmetic of possibility. How many people could afford a car if the price fell? How fast could parts be made if work was organized differently? How would you sell motion to an entire country that still feared it? Picture him standing in a dusty storefront, watching a family press their faces to a new machine, eyes bright with a future he could make cheaper and more reliable. If you've ever had everything taken from you, your savings, your reputation, the belief of those you love, you know the weight of his quiet resolve. What would you do in that moment? Rebuild exactly the same or rebuild smarter? Tell us in the comments where you felt rock bottom, and if you want to follow how Henry turned that ruin into an empire, stay with us. What comes next changes not only a company, but the whole idea of industry. The years between failure and rebirth were not cinematic triumphs. They were long mornings under oil lamps, afternoons of hustling for parts, evenings swallowed by ledgers. Picture Henry in a low-ceilinged workshop on Detroit's west side, the scent of hot metal and coal, a single gas jet throwing shadows over a crude chassis. Outside, wagons clattered and neighbors whispered. After the collapse of his first company and the bitter split from the second, creditors came with polite faces and pointed hands. "You're chasing ghosts," a banker told him in a brown-paneled office, fingers drumming a ledger. Ford, face crusted with grime and a quiet stubbornness in his voice, answered simply, "Then I'll build the right ghost." Those losses were not just financial. They were a stripping away of vanity. The ridicule, cartoons printed in the paper, well-dressed men at clubs trading bets on whether he'd return to the farm, could have hollowed him. Instead, Ford used it like a whetstone. He cataloged every failure. Engines too complex, prices too high, production too slow, management too diffuse. He reduced prideful engineering to ruthless questions. What do customers actually need? What can be simplified without losing reliability? What processes can be repeated, broken down into predictable motions? In quiet, almost clinical experiments, he learned the economics of repetition. He standardized parts until any mechanic could swap a valve in minutes. He tightened decisions, fewer options, fewer colors, one clear purpose: affordability. The famous impatience with waste transformed into a strategy. If a task could be done by someone with modest training, it would be moved out of a specialist's hands and into a process. He began sketching assembly not as theory but as choreography. Each worker a node in a continuous flow, each minute shaved off translating directly into lower prices and higher sales. Emotionally, the pivot was brutal and freeing. He had to swallow pride and admit that elegance for the elite did not scale. He traded admiration for reach. And as he taught himself to think in units, margins, and motion studies, a new kind of courage took hold, the sort that accepts embarrassment today to buy inevitability tomorrow. What follows is the desperate gamble born from that clarity, the invention that would turn ridicule into revolution. The night before the first moving assembly line ran, the Highland Park plant smelled of coal smoke and damp iron. Men dozed against crates, tools like talismans at their belts. Henry Ford walked the rows, hands in his pockets, listening to the low chorus of breathing and distant clanks. He had been laughed at, bankrupted, mocked in print. Twice. Tonight those echoes felt less like shame and more like a ledger you could finally close with action. "We make it simple," he told a foreman, voice soft but absolute. "We make one good car, and make 1,000 of them." The gamble was not a flash of inspiration but a cruel arithmetic. If he could shave time from each task, if parts fit every time and workers repeated the same motion without error, costs would fall. Price, then, would be the weapon. Ford did not simply invent the moving line. He reimagined production as a rhythm, a choreography that turned human labor into measured beats. When the first chassis rolled past the stationary workers, the plant held its breath. Tools moved like hands in a well-rehearsed play. A bolt gone in a motion, a gasket pressed, a part passed along. The change was visceral. Machines stopped waiting for men. Men now moved with the machines. Outside, the papers still sneered. Inside, orders began to stack. The Model T, plain, sturdy, unromantic, arrived like a manifesto. It was not built for wealthy taste but for daily life. A reliable ox for modern roads. Price fell from luxury to possibility. Farmers who once saved every season could now imagine a trip to town. A tradesman could reach customers farther away. A young family could dream of summer beyond the county line. The elites jeered at uniformity, failing to see how freedom hides in affordability. That night, with oil on his hands and the faint ache of a man who had burned too many bridges to turn back, Henry understood something fundamental. Dominance often demands humility. You must make something less for the sake of making it for everyone. He had bet his reputation on process, not prestige, and the bet began to pay out with a steady, irresistible thud of production. If you've ever had to choose between perfection and reach, between making something beautiful for a few or something useful for many, what would you risk to tip the scales? If this moment speaks to you, like the video and subscribe to follow the last chapter of how that risk reshaped not just a company, but an entire world. The shop smells of oil and hot iron, dusk lights slicing through dusty windows as history tightens like a vice. Henry Ford stands at the bench where failure taught him the anatomy of a machine and the anatomy of a market. He remembers 2 companies folded beneath him, the laughter in boardrooms, the ledger lines that refused to bend. A voice from those years, sharp, incredulous, still rings in his head. "You lost everything twice. Why try again?" He answers now, not with bravado but with method, because he learned what failure could not hide. He learned what customers actually wanted, what a production process could become when every motion was counted, and how price and accessibility could reshape demand. We watch the first tentative assembly lines ripple into a revolution. A worker turns a crank. Another fits a part in rhythm. A conveyor hums like a new kind of pulse. The Model T is not magic. It's engineering married to empathy. Ford's gamble was simple and surgical. Simplify the product until it could be made cheaper, restructure labor and space until time was the variable that fell, and set a price that invited millions rather than a quiet few. Those moves destroyed monopolies not with brute force but with inevitability. A cheaper car meant a larger market, and a larger market reshaped industry rules overnight. For you, the lesson sits plain on the table. When debt stacks up or customers thin out, don't chase glamour. Isolate the constraint. Cut complexity that hides cost. Standardize what you can so quality becomes repeatable, not heroic. Price to create demand, not just margin. Build processes that allow you to scale without doubling chaos. Ford didn't invent persistence. He refined his failures into an operating system. Imagine, in the same dusty light, someone asking you now, what would you rebuild differently if you had to start again? Leave that answer below, your biggest financial or professional pain, and join the conversation. If you found this journey useful, a like helps others find it. If you want more practical stories turned into playbooks, subscribe and we'll keep walking these paths together. There are more chapters in the way industries bend when one person chooses method over myth, and the next turn may be the one that changes everything.